Hi, my name is Christian and my call sign is Kilo 7 X-Ray Tango November. I'm one of your instructors for the technician license course being put on by the Amateur Radio Club of the University of Washington. Ahead of the class, we wanted to share a brief introduction to explain what ham radio is. So to begin, let's talk about what amateur radio is legally. In regulatory terms, amateur or ham radio is a personal radio service authorized, regulated, and enforced by the United States Federal Communications Commission, or FCC. Other countries also have amateur radio services that are authorized, regulated, and enforced by their equivalent agencies. According to the FCC, the amateur radio service has four overarching purposes. First, to advance skills in the technical and communication phases of the radio art. Second, to promote the development of an emergency communication capability to assist communities when needed. Third, to develop a pool of trained radio operators. And fourth, to promote international goodwill by connecting private citizens in countries around the globe. To participate in amateur radio, you need to have an operator slash primary station license from the FCC. Now, a brief aside, you'll notice that several terms or phrases on this slide are in blue font. The blue font is to call them to your attention because those specific terms or phrases are in the correct answers to exam questions in the technician license exam. You'll learn more about the license exam in another video. So that was the regulatory basis and purpose of amateur radio according to the FCC. But it still begs the question, what is amateur radio actually, or in practice? Amateur radio is multiple things. On one level, it's a set of frequency allocations in the radio spectrum. As you'll learn, the electromagnetic spectrum is vast and it's used for all kinds of purposes, from your cell phone and home Wi-Fi to GPS to broadcast radio and television stations. It's an incredibly valuable public resource, and some of it's set aside just for amateur radio operators to use and experiment with. Ham radio is also a community of users who are licensed to transmit and receive communications in that portion of the radio spectrum allocated to us. Ham radio is an evolving set of technologies to encode and decode information in radio frequencies in order to communicate in that portion of the radio spectrum. This technology includes things like little handheld radios, walkie-talkies, to large radio installations with big antennas and everything in between. And finally, amateur radio is a set of formal and informal conventions on how we use those technologies in the radio spectrum that's allocated to us. It's those conventions, essentially etiquette, that allows us to operate with our fellow hams in the US and around the world courteously and effectively. What makes ham radio different? There are actually a lot of unlicensed personal radio services or licensed services where you only have to pay a licensing fee but don't have to pass an exam that are a lot easier to access than amateur radio. For example, there's the Family Radio Service, or FRS. These are the walkie-talkies that you typically find in sporting goods stores or outdoor retailers. These are low-power handheld radios, walkie-talkies, that transmit and receive on a predefined set of 22 channels. There's a related service called the General Mobile Radio Service, or GMRS. It operates on the same set of channels as FRS, but requires a license, and it offers slightly higher power and some greater technical capabilities. And you're likely familiar with the Citizens Band, or CB radios. These are often mobile radios installed in vehicles, and they're associated with long-haul truckers and popularized in movies like Smokey and the Bandit. And more recently, there's a service called the Multiple User Radio Service, or MERS, that's popular among some hikers and campers. All of these are FCC regulated personal radio services. They're all relatively low power. They operate on between 2 watts and 50 watts. They all use predefined channels in very, very narrow segments of the radio spectrum. And they all have tight limitations on the type of frequency modulation, and I know that doesn't mean anything to you right now, but it will, and tight limitations on the equipment they can use. Now, amateur radio, on the other hand, is given a lot of freedom, and we're generally given a lot of discretion over the equipment, frequency modulation, and power that we use, both as individual users and as a community. And we're encouraged to experiment and innovate within the hobby. We've been given dedicated portions of the radio spectrum across a wide range of bands. With a few exceptions, we're not required to adhere to channels. We're allowed to use very high power, up to 1500 watts, which for reference, that's in the range used by your microwave to heat food. It's a lot of power. Aside from the high levels of transmitter power we're allowed to use, we're also allowed to experiment by modifying or making our own equipment, including making our own radios, our own antennas, and our own amplifiers. And amateur radio operators have often been in the forefront of developing new ways of encoding or modulating information in radio waves, including coming up with innovative ways to digitize information and transmit it reliably, even under some of the worst conceivable conditions, conditions where communication with conventional technologies is impossible. In general, rather than being limited by the specific tools we can use, we're entrusted with adhering to behaviors, like not transmitting outside of the bands we're authorized to use and not interfering with other users. We're given pretty extraordinary privileges in our amateur radio hobby. With more privileges comes more responsibility. Because of the capabilities of amateur radio, both in terms of power and the variety of ways we're allowed to modulate and transmit radio communications, we have the potential to interfere with many other users of the radio spectrum. And ham radios, in many cases, have unlimited reach, easily reaching outside of the United States, into other national jurisdictions, and even into space. The reason that ham radio is licensed and requires passing an exam to become licensed is because the FCC needs to ensure that operators are qualified to safely, legally, and appropriately operate their radios. Our goal is to help you pass your exam, but it's also to equip you with the essential information to begin operating as a good citizen of our hobby, safely and without interfering with other users. There are currently three classes of amateur radio license granted by the FCC. The first level is the technician class. The second, middle level, is the general class, and the third and highest level is the amateur extra class. Each license class specifies a set of privileges an operator has. The general and amateur extra licenses grant access to progressively more of the radio spectrum, particularly on the high frequency or HF bands, which are the bands we typically use to communicate over long distances. The general and amateur extra also give you the ability to become credentialed as a volunteer examiner. These are the hams who proctor the licensing exams. And finally, but not least, by studying to pass the additional licensing exams, you can further develop your depth of knowledge in the radio arts. While this class is focused on preparing you to pass your technician class license, you will have the opportunity to also take the general class license exam, and we'll encourage you to give it a try. We'll talk more about that in another video. Last but not least, as you begin your journey into the amateur radio hobby, you should know what the origin of the term ham radio is. It actually traces its roots back to the days of telegraphy and the heyday of rail travel in the United States, before there was telephone and communication was through telegraphs using a telegraph key to tap out messages in Morse code. There was huge demand for telegraphers as the railroads expanded, and railroad superintendents often hired unskilled but cheap operators to meet the demand. These cheap telegraphers were ham-fisted and were derisively called hams. This term was carried over into radio when telegraphy made the leap to wireless communications. And like many communities and groups before and since, amateur radio operators appropriated what was originally a pejorative and adopted it as the nickname for our hobby. That concludes our brief introduction to ham radio. If you have any questions ahead of class, don't hesitate to reach out, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon. 73, this is Christian, K7XTN, I'm Claire.